Okay, so when you think Jane Austen, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, right, it's this image of a quiet spinster, kind of tucked away in a country parsonage, just writing these really charming novels about love and marriage. It's a nice, cozy picture.
But what if I told you that whole image was basically a PR campaign? Yeah, we're going to dive into that because the real story is so much more complicated and honestly, way more interesting. We're going to peel back all those layers and find the real woman, the sharp, funny, incredibly tough woman who became this literary giant totally against all the odds.
So our little investigation here starts with a single number, 160. That's it. That's how many of Jane Austen's personal letters we have left today. I mean, these letters are our most direct line to her real voice, what she was actually thinking. But then, you see this number, roughly 3,000. That's the estimate of how many letters she probably wrote. So you gotta ask, right? Where are the rest of them? What happened to 95% of her correspondence? And let me tell you, this was no accident. This was deliberate. This was the beginning of a massive cover-up. And that brings us right to our first section, the myth of Jane Austen. Because, to really get who she was, we first have to unpack the image that our own family so carefully built for everyone else. So after she died, her family went into overdrive, creating this legend of good, quiet Aunt Jane. You see this portrait here? It became the official face of Austen, and it's based on a sketch by her sister Cassandra. But here's the twist. It was Cassandra who also burned almost all of Jane's letters. She literally erased the real Jane from history. And what you have to get is that Cassandra wasn't trying to protect a saint. Oh no. She was hiding a genius with a very sharp tongue. And here's the reason why. Cassandra's whole goal was to shield the family from Jane's, her incredibly sharp tongue and brutally honest opinions. The letters she tossed in the fire, they were full of what's been called acid or forthright comments. So the woman they were trying to hide wasn't some shy, quiet little thing. She was a brilliant, satirical observer who was definitely not afraid to say what she thought.
So, where did this incredible wit even come from? I mean, it didn't just pop up out of thin air, right? It was something she worked on from a super young age. For Jane, writing wasn't just some hobby she picked up later on. It was everything to her, right from the start.
Yeah, forget everything you think you know about sweet, proper romances. Get this, starting when she was just 11, Austen was writing these stories that are described as boisterous and anarchic. We're talking about these wild, hilarious fantasies where women are powerful, misbehaving, and just completely flipping social rules upside down. That is where her real voice came from.
And just look at the amount of stuff she wrote. It's incredible. Her early work, which we call the Juvenilia, fills up 3 whole notebooks. We're talking almost 90,000 words of pure, brilliant satire. This wasn't some kid just doodling in a notebook. This was a serious, dedicated writer who was already becoming a master of her craft.
And of course, all this writing was coming from her own life experiences. The stuff at the heart of her novels, that tricky dance between love, your place in society, and just having enough money to live, well, that was her reality. She knew all about it. When she was 20, she had this whirlwind romance with a young Irish lawyer, a guy named Tom Lefroy. And just listen to the energy in this letter she wrote to Cassandra about him. She jokes that their flirting was profligate and shocking. I mean, does that sound like a reserved, quiet spinster to you? No way! That's a young woman who is bursting with life and humor. But, sadly, the families didn't think it was a practical match, and that was it. They never saw each other again.
Okay, so fast forward a few years, and Jane is faced with this huge, life-altering choice. She gets her one and only marriage proposal. It's from this rich landowner, Harris Bigwither. And just look at the situation here. On one hand, the offer, complete financial security, not just for her, but for her whole family. On the other hand, the guy. He's described as large, plain, tactless, even aggressive. It meant a life, as she later put it, without affection.
And what she did next? It tells you everything you need to know about her. For one night, she was practical. She said yes, she accepted. But when she woke up the next morning, her true self, her integrity, just couldn't do it. She took it all back. She chose the risk of poverty over a life without love. I mean, that's a choice straight out of one of her own novels, isn't it?
So there you have it. She chose her art, she chose herself over an easy life. But deciding to be a professional writer back then, well, that was a whole other battle, and it was a fight she had to wage completely behind the scenes.
Just look at this timeline. It's basically a story of rejection after rejection. She finishes the first draft of Pride and Prejudice in 1797. It gets rejected immediately, like declined by return of post. Ouch. Then, in 1803, she actually sells another book for £10, but the publisher just does nothing with it for years. Think about that. It took 14 years, 14, from when she finished her first great novel to when she finally got a book published. What this really shows you is just how unbelievably persistent she was. She just never gave up.
And even when she finally got published, her name wasn't on the cover. Take a look at the title page of her first book. See who wrote it? It just says, by a lady. That's it.
And she had to do this. This was basically a requirement back then. In the early 1800s, if you were a woman and you wanted to be a full-time professional author, well, that was seen as almost improper. It wasn't ladylike. So being anonymous was like a shield. It kept up this little fantasy that writing was just a polite little hobby and not, the serious, groundbreaking work it actually was.
Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. How on earth did this anonymous lady from a small town in England, a woman whose real personality was deliberately hidden from view, become one of the most famous and beloved authors on the entire planet?
Well, let's start at the end of her story, actually. Jane Austen died way too young, in 1817, at just 41, and she was buried in this really prestigious place, Winchester Cathedral, which shows you her family had some status. But the original gravestone her brother wrote, it's really telling, but for what it leaves out.
It goes on and on about her faith, her kindness, the extraordinary endowments of her mind. But there is not a single word about her being a writer. Not one. At the moment she died, her life's work, her greatest achievement, was either seen as too unimportant or maybe even too embarrassing to mention on her own gravestone. It's just wild.
But history, as it often does, had a very different idea. Her fame just started to build, slowly at first, and then it just exploded. Her books got re-released in the 1830s. Then in 1869, her nephew published that memoir. And yeah, it was a pretty cleaned-up version of her, but it got her story out there. By the late 1800s, there was this massive fan craze. They even had a name for it, Austenolatry. And now, she's a global icon. She's on money. And you know what's interesting? Even when she was alive, the smartest people got it. Sir Walter Scott, who was basically the biggest author of the time, he totally saw her genius. He praised her for her unbelievable realism, for making art out of just normal, everyday life. He saw what took the rest of the world decades to figure out, that her seemingly quiet stories were actually revolutionary.
So that leaves us with one last big question. In this crazy, fast-paced world we live in, why do we keep coming back to her voice? A voice from 200 years ago, a voice that was ignored and then actively silenced. Well, maybe it's because when you finally peel back that myth of quiet Aunt Jane, you don't just find a great writer. You find this incredible story of resilience, of wit, and of a woman who, no matter what, insisted on telling the truth about the world as she saw it.